Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Students in Mind's Wellbeing Amidst Uncertainty panel. My name is Julian. I use he, him pronouns, and I am one of the members of the Students in Mind team who put together this panel today. And we are so glad to have you guys here to talk about these important topics at these times. So thank you so much for joining. Let's go through a quick, just general outline before getting into details for today. We're going to be, after our introduction, taking a look at the panel for 45 minutes discussion. After that, we're going to have a 5-minute break in between. We're going to continue our discussion after that for another 20 minutes or so, and then finish off with a little bit of Q&A from the audience. So we ask that if you have any questions for the panelists, please do reserve them until then. If there's anything that does come up during the presentation, that you'd like to let any of us know, you can go ahead and message one of our staff directly. They all have an underscore underneath their display names. But before we get into the panel itself, I think it's important that we go ahead with a land acknowledgement for McGill, since they are our hosting university, and for a lot of us who are in Montreal. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nations, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. Students in Mind honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and the waters on which we are hosting our events. Just because some of us have not been faced with certain issues does not mean that they are not happening. We must bring up these circumstances for greater public awareness and actively oppose systems of oppression. It is not enough to just acknowledge these struggles. We must ensure that we are educated about such matters and put meaning to them in hopes of stepping towards an equitable and mutually respectful relationship. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought every individual to reside on the land, and to seek to understand their place within history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is an ongoing current process, and we need to build our mindfulness to be present and be mindfulness of our present participation. Therefore, everyone is encouraged to acknowledge and learn more about the colonial history about the land that they are currently on. We'd also like to open up with a mention about sustainability. We are proud to announce that our event has received the virtual event certification for the McGill Office of Sustainability. To achieve the certification, we implemented actions such as working with socially responsible sponsors to make sure our event follows the accessibility guidelines. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead into our panel theme for tonight. For our panel today, we will be focusing on addressing the question of, as students and community leaders, how can we be present and purposeful when the future is uncertain? Certain topics that will be discussed include if and how our mental health has shifted during the past year of uncertainty, the general well-being of our society, as well as tips and resources to cope with the new challenges and the role of advocacy and how it can help well-being. We are excited to welcome 4 panelists to guide this discussion and provide insights that we hope can benefit us all. Before we go into the introduction of those panelists, let's go over some quick community rules for the video session today. So, mental health, while it's something that we all possess and share, is also incredibly personal and unique given the multifaceted nature of our lived experiences. With this in mind, we would like to take the time to highlight the following. If you have at any point any concerns and you'd like to provide us with some feedback or you require assistance, please, again, do message any one of our executive members in the chat. All of our execs have an underscore in front of our names, and we have our preferred pronouns displayed as well. If you would like to, we also welcome you to edit your names to include your preferred pronouns. Keeping in mind that this event welcomes and encourages a healthy and fruitful discussion and debate on different issues surrounding mental health, we would like to remind participants that this panel enforces a safer space policy. This aims to ensure that all in attendance are respected regardless of race, identity, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religious beliefs. If you at any point feel as though your safety is at risk, please report any persons or incidents to an executive member immediately. Finally, we would like to invite you all to turn off your mics and cameras during the panel in order to conserve energy. Panelists, please go ahead and keep them on. We're going to need you guys on screen. All right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask our panelists one at a time to introduce themselves. Please do include your name, pronouns, and a little bit about your background, what got you started today. I'm going to call on Mo to get the conversation started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mo. I use they, them pronouns. I am here with kind of two hats on. I am the outreach coordinator for the Union for Gender Empowerment, which is a service of the SMU. And I am also the mental health advocacy coordinator for the SMU mental health portfolio. So I have been actually working with people with students' mind in my capacity as mental health advocacy coordinator. And yeah, a lot of my work this year has, I think, for a lot of people is really focusing on well-being and wellness and making sure that students are properly supported in these, as we often say, unprecedented times. And so I'm excited to be here.
And thank you so much for being here, Mo. We're really happy to have your perspective in these two hats as we go forward. I'm going to go call on Chandi to please, and correct me if I pronounce your name wrong, to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Chandani. I'm a South Asian and queer person. I go by they, them. I'm a student of psychology, humanities, and studio arts at Concordia University. And I'm here representing PAC, that's the Pan-Asian Collective, that has a couple of ties in Concordia and McGill and other universities.
And thank you so much for the perspective. Chandani, am I saying that correctly?
Chandani.
Chandani.
Yeah, you got it.
I got it, okay.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. We think that especially when we're taking a look at perspectives for how we know that COVID has, especially in the early days, affected different communities, especially the Asian community, somewhat disproportionately. Being able to get that take on our conversation is super valued as well. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to call on Shannon to introduce themselves next.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Shannon Walsh. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I'm the local wellness advisor at McDonald campus and member of the Student Wellness Hub. So I guess I'm kind of wearing two hats as well, as Elwa for Mac campus, but also as a representative of the Hub. I am a grad from McGill myself. Feels like a very long time ago, but I did my undergrad and my graduate studies in educational and counseling psychology many moons ago at McGill. And I'm involved in many different things right now, from working with students one-on-one, doing some wellness planning for students who are in the province currently, also offering support groups that happen regularly, and running workshops along with my colleagues in the Hub. And I'll share more about that later, but those are just some of the things that I've been involved in to try and help shift things and improve the climate and culture of well-being on our campus virtually. I think it's been more important than ever, so I really appreciate being invited to this discussion.
And thank you so much for joining us, Shannon. I know that McGill has been doing a whole bunch of different adapting and shifting during the past couple of months to be able to try to support their students. And so to be able to get insight into how that's going and how that's worked out compared to what you were looking for is going to be really invaluable to being able to continue those conversations. So thank you for going over here. Last but not least, Dr. Richard Kostner, if you please. Let me unmute you so that you can go ahead and get started.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So I'm Richard Kestner. I use the pronouns he and him. I've been here 30 years, but you can still pick up a New York accent. It's actually a Queens accent. I don't think I will ever get rid of it. But I've I I teach and I do research on motivation, and I've given a number of webinars and talks about how to stay happy and productive during the pandemic. I've never had a year like this. It's been wild and unimaginable. Uh, I'm learning a lot from other people and from doing these things. And thank you for inviting me.
For sure. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kestner. Am I saying that properly?
Yes, you could call me Richard, though. That's fine.
All right, Richard, it will be.
Yeah.
For sure, that academic perspective, not only from the research point of view, but also, I imagine how you've been trying to roll that out in your own classroom as you're still working through. It will be great to be able to see how that has been working out over the past couple of months. And
Yeah, I
rest
have a
assured, I don't
story
think
to tell about that. Yeah, so yeah, I'll be
sure
interested
we'll
to
hear
talk
it
about that.
soon.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. And don't worry, I don't think we'll ever ask you to get rid of that Queen's accent. I think it just adds a little bit more charm to the mix.
No, not
So,
really, but
so let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot of ground that we'd like to cover tonight and a lot of different angles that we're going to take. But starting at a very first level, maybe just going around in the same order that we introduced ourselves, very basically, and then we can get into a little more discussion afterwards. Starting with Mo again, tell us, how have you seen mental health, your own or others, shift during this past year of uncertainty? What has changed?
I mean, I think we can all agree that in many ways our mental health has gotten worse in a lot of ways, but also ironically in a lot of ways, this pandemic has changed a lot of how we approach the world and how we approach each other. And in a sense, it has also provided a lot of opportunity for more understanding and more kindness in approaching each other. And this has fostered a better environment. Obviously, this isn't said of everyone. There is still a lot of difficulty and unkindness going on, but we've seen a lot of people come together. And I think this has created I would say an augmentation in our mental health, both for the better, but responding to something for the worse. So, I mean, I know for myself, I've really experienced a lot of difficulty, but at the same time, there have been things in my life that I don't think would have been possible without this pandemic, which is sometimes weird to say and not great to sometimes admit, because you don't want something good to be coming of such a difficult time in the world and for everybody. And especially if you're benefiting from something that a lot of people are being hurt from. But it also means that, you know, the world is changing, and hopefully we will continue to change past when this pandemic ends.
I think you bring up like a very subtle point, which is that idea that, you know, we do on the one hand want to be cognizant of those good things that have come and appreciate and grateful for those things, the good things that have come. But there's always a twinge of guilt to a certain extent about how, I don't know if it's as an individual, if it's as a group or society, but like, why did something bad have to happen for something good to come out of it? Why couldn't that come in the first place? So yeah, for sure, those two sides definitely make sense. Chandani, what's the last little while been like for you?
The past couple of months have definitely been a wild ride. Testing, I think, everybody on like in so many ways that we never expected to like be tested before. And so the main question when you ask like what's going on in these uncertain times, how is our mental stability changing? Well, everything is uncertain. There's nothing you can actually rely on these days. Nothing is like known or definite. And I feel that the only thing you could really kind of be certain in is really yourself. And so in that sense, you don't really have, like, especially during this pandemic, there's been no choice but to kind of work on yourself. With the whole quarantine, it kind of had us all like hauled up at home and kind of sitting with ourselves, like dwelling within ourselves. It led to a lot of quiet time, a lot of thinking time. And I think that was very hard for a lot of people because we're not used to that kind of like slower way of living, of not constantly like going. And so it was a time of a lot of contemplation, a lot of like inner work. It forced you to kind of like face yourself in that way. For myself, I've lived with a lot of anxiety and unrest my whole life, and I always kind of just had the tendency of like putting it on the back seat. But with this pandemic, it had this way of kind of like exacerbating everything and kind of like putting it in your face, even if you didn't want to face that for such a long time. And then with all of that, it's kind of like brought things to a boiling point, and that's kind of where Black Lives Matter happened, I believe. And so this uncertainty, it has like a huge effect on our psyche, our mental health, because especially as North Americans, we like to have like control over everything, and we like to know what's happening. We like to like be in the loop. And this year we just didn't know. We had to let go of that control, and we had to like practice the act of acceptance and just accepting, like going day by day and living everything one day at a time, because we never knew when this was going to end. And so we had to sort of like learn to pay attention to the small things and the little things that we could control, like the state of your house, or what you're going to cook, or what you're going to fill your time with in the next like couple of hours. And for me, that led to a lot of practicing of intention. So doing things one action at a time, doing things slowly, doing things in a more mindful manner, in a completely mindless and a completely distracted world. So that's it. I think we're paying attention now. We're paying attention to ourselves. We're paying attention to everybody else. We're paying attention to how we treat ourselves, to how we treat each other, to how we treat our bodies, how we like wear masks every time that we leave the house and put sanitizer on. And so it's been about like finding purpose and finding meaning in those little things. So for myself personally, that's how I've understood this whole shift of mental health.
For sure. The idea that it's been the combination of uncertainty and isolation has concocted something that I don't think anybody was totally prepared for. You know, as you pointed out, when you do spend a lot of time alone, just with yourself, there's a lot of, in a lot of ways, brutal honesty that comes from having to look at yourself. And sometimes in a fast world, as you described, not everybody wanted to or was ready to maybe take a look at that. Some of us definitely were able to take that to the next level. And it sounds like you were able to do that by, you know, practicing appreciation, being having intentions, you know, trying to take control of the small things that you were able to move forward with. At the same time, there are definitely some other people who just didn't have access to their usual coping or their usual support mechanisms. And so it's created a kind of void that I think you really described eloquently, this idea that we've had to fill that void with parts of ourselves in order to regain some sense of control over our lives. So thank you for those observations. Shannon, how's it been for you?
Well, I feel like I could give like two separate answers. Obviously me as a person, right, as a human being who, like all of you, has gone through this crazy time, and what that's been like as a parent of two kids and as a wife and as a daughter and friend. Never ever have I been so acutely aware of my own well-being, kind of in parallel to the students that I support. You know, I will say that as a local wellness advisor, certainly I have received and caught a very high amount of anxiety, unlike I've ever seen in the 20 years that I've worked with students. I will agree completely that this has been a time that has magnified things that maybe we were shelving or, you know, not paying too much attention to. A spotlight has been shone on things that perhaps we had hidden in the dark, right? at the same time, and many people have talked about the pandemic as a process much like grief, right? So there's been this sifting effect, right, where things that weren't important really now are not important, and the things that are important feel so much more important, right? Like our connections, our family, our health. So there has been a lot of beauty in that process. And I have to say, as hard as some of the stories that I've heard from students, either one-on-one or in group settings, have been, I've also heard some really incredible stories of realization, of kind of reconfiguring of priorities, restructuring of wants, you know. So I'm really honored to do the work that I do. So I'm grateful to be able to do that. I'm grateful to have a job at a time when a lot of people don't have a job, right? But it's certainly been interesting to have my own stress and anxiety and my kids, and also be in this working role where I have to, you know, put that aside for a moment and be able to serve students. So I really feel for the student experience. I don't know how I would have done with remote learning. It's something, right? So.
No, it is something I think that we are all learning to be able to cope with, both, you know, teaching staff and support staff and students alike. I think you brought up something really interesting, which is that professional versus personal involvement and, I guess, emotional investment that we have in the world. Just sort of sharing on that, I am as well as a psychology student. I realized I forgot to introduce myself a bit, but I'm also currently working as a counselor for Kids Help Phone. And so I share that personal and professional wants to be able to support others. I do also want to encourage people to think about, though, how we all are in a certain way, even if not professionals, still supporters. And whenever we do step into that supporting role, we do have to put some of ourselves aside to make room for the people that we're trying to be able to be there for. And balancing that has been incredibly difficult, especially when the part of yourself that you're trying to be able to put aside to make room, it feels so heavy when there's so much going on with it. At the same time, as you mentioned, the effort that goes into being able to strike that balancing act becomes in a lot of ways more rewarding. And having that time to be able to, you know, sift between those things that are truly rewarding, truly important to us, and maybe those things that aren't, will definitely be one of the silver linings that I think a lot of people will take away from this time of uncertainty. So thank you for that. Yeah. Richard, from your point of view, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you one more time, and then we'll go ahead and get started. What's it been like from your point of view?
Yes, so I relate to many of the things that you all said. I always say I'm embarrassed, but it's also guilty that there's a part of me that's adapted pretty easily to the pandemic and a lifestyle where I roll out of bed, go down to my computer, have a bagel, and I start working. And I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert. And so during the summer and the fall, I've actually been doing more outreach than I've ever done in my 30-year career, because I could do the outreach from my office downstairs rather than having to get in the metro, to get dressed up, to worry about whether I put my tie on correctly. And there's a laxness about giving a presentation that makes it all so much easier for me. So, but I realize I'm privileged in the position I have and the role I have. Now, I early on, I was asked by the McGill Alumni and Students Association to give a talk about the pandemic and goal setting. So I gave the talk, and I was stunned that there were like 600 people watching it. And what I highlighted is I had read a book about disasters by Amanda Ripley, and she pointed out that everyone experiences it differently. So when she's asked, how are people experiencing the pandemic? She says you can't answer that because different groups, different types of people experience it differently. And I've been trying to be aware of that. And in my first talk, I decided to focus on people who are in the situation that Shannon is in, where she's a working mom and she had her kids come home and she had to supervise their online activities. And I have a lot of former students who were in that position, they're professors, and they were telling me they felt so guilty because they couldn't manage their kids and do their work. So they would help the kids with school in the morning, but then they'd let the kids watch the Disney Channel in the afternoon. And they felt very guilty about letting the kids watch 4 hours of Star Wars cartoons every day. And I said, no, be self-compassionate. Don't be harsh with yourself. We have to not be tough with ourselves during this very tough period. And I thought I had done a really nice job. And then I got an email from a lady I know at the university. And she said, I appreciate everything you said, but you didn't talk about the people who are alone, who aren't married, who don't have kids. And then I realized, oh my gosh, those of us who have families, we might think we see too much of them. But early on in March and April, if you're a single person, your life is probably built around seeing your friends, going to the YMCA, going to church. And all of those things were denied to single people. They basically had no one else to see. And the isolation was, by this lady's email, I became very aware of how much more isolating this has all been. The other thing I wanted to say is when this began, I felt I had a similar experience, which was the ice storm in 1998. None of you, you may not have even been born back then, but the ice storm was really scary. It happened, I think, right before New Year's, and all of the electricity went out in many neighborhoods. And then the water supply was threatened. So the water filtering system wasn't working. And then we were told we couldn't leave the island, planes couldn't come in. I thought we would be left to our own devices or something. And that lasted for like 6 or 8 weeks. But the thing that happened in the ice storm, which was so different, was there was a sense of community. And there were like shocking acts of kindness and generosity where neighbors on one side of the street would have the electricity and they'd take in people from across the street. And there was a lot of that kind of generosity and community. And I don't think we've had that with the pandemic because other people can give us COVID-19 and we've been told stay away from other people. And Amanda Ripley, who's the expert on disaster, says almost always one of the stages is a stage of community and seeking out others. People don't go off on their own and just look out for themselves. They actually try to find a group and other people to help and to work with. And to some extent, early on, I don't think we had that. I think all of you are doing things like this event to try to create a community and to create a sense of being helpful to others. But early on in the pandemic, I think that was missing. And I'll be honest, I'm very scared about what's happening in the United States and Ontario and what's going to happen over the next 2-3 months here. I'm really frightened that it's going to be a complete lockdown again and that we're going to be back where we were in March. And that's going to be hard.
And I think you're definitely not alone in that fear.
Yeah.
It would be fair to say, I think, that especially those first few months that you identify were scarring, traumatizing, even for a lot of people.
Yes.
I think you highlighted really well the idea that different people do have different circumstances, not just internal who they are, introverts versus extroverts, but also external ones, the people around them, the supports that they have, the supports that they have in their own house. And those differences make it difficult, if not impossible, to make a couple of generalizations even when we're talking about it, because I think, similar to Shannon's example of how things have been sifted and exacerbated in a lot of ways, those differences in circumstance have also exacerbated the different realities that people are living through as they work through this. So despite those differences, you also mentioned another thing which is interesting, which is this common want to reach out to community. And it seems like that one commonality has been shattered in a lot of ways by the nature of the pandemic that we're going in. Finding that grounding, I think, Chandani talked about briefly, in the stuff that we're doing individually, but it sounds like in the past that grounding has also been reaching out to others to help them when we also needed help. And so I think that we're going to definitely be moving forward in this conversation today, but also when we're going forward after our conversation today, to be able to seek that reference point that we can start to work around. So, thank you guys so much for sharing those experiences about how the last little while has been for you. And we're hearing a lot of common ground in terms of just how hard, difficult it's been over the last little while. Also glimmers of hope here and there, and some hesitancy, I think, about what exactly that means for us and as a group and as a society. So hopefully in our conversation, we're not going to solve or find any straight answers, but we might get a little bit closer to some kind of understanding. So moving forward from that, thank you guys for those individual ideas. I'm going to invite you all to, if you're comfortable, unmute or mute as you feel is fit, so that we can go into a more conversation section. I'm going to do a little bit less of a back and forth moderating and a little bit more of a guiding question, so that we can take a look at what you guys think of the different opinions that have been brought up and the different opinions that will be brought up. So to move on into the more discussion-based section for today, the first topic that we want to look at is general well-being. So we've talked a lot about the different ways that people have been trying to adapt and in a lot of ways react to the things that have been happening to them. So I'm wondering, when you guys look at your groups, understanding that we all are part of some very different groups, which is why we've asked you guys to come here today. Have you noticed if our groups have started caring more about well-being and mental health among the last little while, or how has that been changing?
I want to kind of push back on the idea that the pandemic has caused community gathering to shatter and to not adhere as well. Through my work at the SMU, I have been connected with a lot of wonderful people who at the beginning of the pandemic, when the world was spinning out of control, decided that we need to have some kind of way to contribute and help and have some sense of control in our lives and make sure that other people can take some more control of their lives as well. There was a mutual aid group that was started. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with mutual aid, it can take many forms. Sometimes they are organizations in which people pay membership fees and can receive community benefits and have sort of community insurance, as it were. Our mutual aid took the form of providing pay what you can, including free grocery delivery service, as well as other forms of aid. We started support groups. We started helping people who were now having issues with medication to coordinate and receive their medication. And really, like, this amazing organization was born out of it. And a few weeks ago, that organization thought we were kaput, we were out of money, and now we are back up and running, and we're going to be running again starting next week. And this is just, it's a phenomenal thing to have seen happen. And so I think, in that sense, what we're looking at with mental health, has kind of changed. I think for a lot of people before this, mental health care and self-care was taking a bubble bath and having scented candles, or doing a nice face mask, and it can be those things as well. But I mean, taking care of yourself and taking care of others really gets down a lot to the basics. Do you have a roof over your head? Do you have food on your table? Do you have a way to safely get to work? I know I had to quit my only non-SMU job because I'm immunocompromised, and I couldn't go safely to the butcher shop where I worked at anymore. That wasn't an option for me, and for a while I had no idea how I was going to pay for rent or groceries. And this amazing community formed in which we really started to support each other. People in that organization bought me food for Passover that I could cook for myself, and it was this wonderful thing. And so our communities have really had to change, and our understanding of mental health has had to change along with that. It has had to force us to look at what is the mental health of people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people who are facing disproportionate effects of COVID-19 in this pandemic. What does self-care look like when you are dealing with racial violence? What does self-care look like when you are disabled and your physical health makes it hard for you to get up out of bed, makes it impossible for you to go out in public, makes it terrifying to go to the grocery store? What does mental health care look like when you don't have the money to put food on the table? What are the things that we can do to not only support ourselves, but each other? And obviously this has not been the reaction of everyone. There have been a lot of people who, there have been the statistics that during the pandemic, the world's richest people have gotten disproportionately richer while everyone else has maintained stagnant or even less than that. And on top of that, you have less than great responses from institutions, including McGill University, that really have not been satisfactory and have required a lot of pushback. And so obviously this does not apply to everyone. This hasn't been a universal experience that every single person, institution, entity has said, we are going to start taking a better look at what mental health care looks like. But it has also pushed those of us who really have cared or who have it in us to care and who don't have a profit to be made off of people's harm and in the pandemic itself. It has pushed people to come together. Only it doesn't look the way that it did in that ice storm. It doesn't look the way that it did in Hurricane Katrina. It doesn't look the way that it did before. And and I haven't only seen this in Montreal. Just like Richard, I'm from New York. I'm from Brooklyn. My parents both got COVID-19 in March and April, and it was horrifying. It was terrifying. But there were people who were supporting them and supporting their communities back home, and this has been around the world. So in a sense, yes, our communities have been fractured, but in another sense, our communities have been working so hard to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind.
I'm hearing that one of the main things that mental health wise has almost changed is we've gone from almost a blanket fits all individual approach to this idea that helping others can be a form of helping ourselves that can actually provide us some personal relief. And number two, that it's not a one size fits all. A lot of the wellness that people are practicing and a lot of what wellness looks like for different people in different groups is strikingly different. 100%.
I'd love to, first of all, it sounds like, Mo, you've been up to some incredible things. It's really exciting to hear some of this. Sometimes out at MAC, I don't always get to hear what SMU and other downtown kind of anchored clubs and organizations are up to, but wow. I'll say that I've heard similar amazing stories of initiatives, of very grassroots and heart-driven things that students have said, you know what, I love to cook. I think I'm going to prepare meals and see who needs food and if I can deliver it safely. And I think a lot of us have looked for purpose, right? Like I loved the beginning question when you asked, like, how can we be present and purposeful in these uncertain times? And I think the answer is in the question, right? So being present and finding some meaning where there seems to be none is the very thing that keeps us going. I know that's been true for me. There's not a day that goes by that I don't say to myself, how can I serve? Is there something that I can do, whether it's a small thing, you know, in my little family bubble or in my community where I live or with my colleagues? I've never felt more connected to students than I have in these last 7-8 months. I have talked to more students. I have faced more students than I ever have. More students are showing up to workshops and support groups than we've ever seen. Students that are joining us at midnight in their country, you know, for a support group and showing up every week because they can't, you know, when I lived through the ice storm, I was a student at McGill at the time. And you're right, like I could go sleep at the friend's house who had heat and electricity, right? We could bunk together and all try and bundle up and sleeping in our winter coats, right? So the connection was so magical, but we had that physical capacity to come together. And this situation, we've had to be so much more creative, right? We've had to look at how can I feel connected when I can't hug my mom? Like, I think one of the most impactful moments I've had is watching my mom back to back with masks and gloves on with my 12-year-old daughter and both of them crying, just to be able to physically touch backs after months of not having any physical contact.
Yeah.
And it's not as good as the hug. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that, but I'm gonna say that like it meant something that a hug I don't think ever meant. So like I love the magic of finding ways to connect that are not traditional, right? So yeah.
I wanted to bring up something that Chania had said about meaning and purpose. And when I started giving my talks in the summer, I also talked about how to be happy during the pandemic. And I distinguished between two classic notions of well-being. The one we're most familiar with and most of us think in terms of is hedonism, where it's basically the balance of positive versus negative things in our life. And we can measure that in terms of pleasant versus unpleasant emotions. And I think it's very clear that during the pandemic, it's been very difficult to maintain our usual level of positive emotions and that our negative emotions are higher. So if we're struggling to be as happy as we usually are, that's a losing battle. However, another tradition, it's called eudaimonic well-being, and it's about being true to yourself, and it's more about being purposeful and wise and knowing yourself. And I think during the pandemic, there are more opportunities to find meaning, in particular in the ways that you've all described, by creating these mutual aid societies, by reaching out to students, by preparing food for others. And it's kind of, you know, I'm embarrassed about this, but I'm more, like I said, I'm more of an introvert and I don't naturally do those kinds of things as much as I should. But during the pandemic, I have. And I've been surprised at how rewarding it is. So there's someone who was in my life 30 years ago, and he's now in a place for, you know, old people. And I call him every week. We talk about the football games and about, it's like one of the best things I do each week. And there is research in my own field that shows it's really surprising that when you do something helpful for others, it redounds back to you, especially if you do it wholeheartedly and not because you feel guilty or not because you want to like think of yourself as an altruistic people, but if you wholeheartedly endorse reaching out and trying to be helpful, that makes us feel real good too. And it's a, you know, I think it spawns something. It spawns a good process. And so I think it's wonderful, everything you have all described. And I think Mo is correct that, you know, the pandemic doesn't have to shatter. I have a pet peeve. I picked it up from Anthony Fauci, I think. He doesn't like the term social distancing. we should physical distance, but we should not social distance. We should do the opposite of social distance. We should seek social closeness by creating the kinds of groups you're talking about, by using the media that we have to stay in touch with people. We should physically distance, but we should not socially distance. We should socially draw closer. And I think just always using that term social distance is the wrong message. It's physical distancing that we want. And we want to stop doing that as soon as we can.
It's an interesting idea. One of the things that I'm picking up on is you mentioned hedonism versus eudaimonism. Is that right? Or yeah. Okay. So that idea of finding meaning, and I think in this case specifically happiness, but as it relates to our conversation, meaning from the things that are outside versus the things that are inside versus the things that come from us, is this interesting idea. And to play off of that idea of language, I noticed that we're talking a lot about finding meaning, but it sounds to me more like we're creating meaning as we go forward.
I wanted to say that I often say making meaning, right? So I love what you just said, Julian, that I think that if it's an action and we're collaborating in its process, I prefer to use a more action word than finding. And sometimes I still slip to finding, but finding almost sounds like it's haphazard, right?
I think it's interesting that you make that distinction between finding and creating, because, well, that's what it's about. It's like, it's creating that within ourselves and making those differences of what's important to us and what's maybe not less important to us, but like what is like the purpose of what we're going to do with our time here. And a lot of people said, somebody said like internal versus external. And so it's external rewards, if you could say, are a lot less gratifying these days. It's a lot more about like what's going to satisfy you internally, what's going to satisfy like your well-being, your mentality, right? And so it's amazing how we've been like moving everything to online, and it's not ideal in a lot of ways, but it's so interesting how in this like weird void of the cyber world, like you find these little niches of these little communities that are opening up and that are like opening up their spaces to people. And like it's so magical that that's being created, and like even among the scary like cyber world, we're able to like find that community and create that community and take that space for ourselves, right?
Yeah, one of the differences I think between this and the ice storm, other than the fact that I was born in the ice storm, was the fact that that we had this internet, this cyber interface to be able to do those connections. Dr. Richard, I'm just going to unmute you really quick because you did mute again. But the internet, how do I say? Yes, I was born in the middle of the ice storm. My parents tell me stories about driving in the Land Rover that they used to have at the time to get to the hospital and get to grandma's for heat. I think a lot of people are experiencing some kind of rebirth too during this storm. Some kind of reorientation in a lot of ways when it comes to those things described.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree that some of us are fine. Well, some of us are making meaning, let's say. Some of us are making connections. Some of us are learning to reach out to others more than we did. And I think some of us are getting more comfortable with social media that we wouldn't ordinarily use very much in our lives. My mom is 87 years old. She was born in Austria. She doesn't have a New York accent. She has an Austrian accent. But my sister got her an iPad about 1 month before the pandemic struck. And at first, my sister had to show her everything, and all my mom could do. She began by following those cruise ships. You know, those cruise ships where the people had COVID? And she was following that every day on her iPad. But now on the weekend, she's arranged, I have cousins in Austria, and she arranged a Skype session where my two Austrian cousins, my sister, my brother, myself, she tries to get my daughter and her boyfriend into this too. And there could be like 10 people in 3 different countries. On Saturdays, we do spend time talking about the pandemic. We spend most of the time talking about Trump. Thank goodness he is finally out of there. But, you know, the fact that my mom had that iPad, and it's become an important part of her survival kit. And interestingly, my two cousins in Austria, they lost their mom, my mother's sister, about 4 years ago. And I realized that when I get off after an hour, they stay on for another half hour to talk with my mom. And I can't imagine anyone wanting to talk to my mom for an hour and a half, but they do that. And I think it's filling a need for them as well. So, and I don't think she would have learned that and done that if it hadn't been the pandemic. I don't want to sugarcoat things though, because I have recently heard that the statistics for young adults and thoughts of suicide are really scary. So that 25% of young adults have thought about suicide in the last month. And if you're a member of a marginalized group, it's like 40%. So uh, I'm always a little bit torn where I see some positive things, but then I also hear the evidence that there's some really high levels of suffering out there too. And then I feel a little guilty and about sometimes just focusing on the positive things I'm seeing.
Which I think it's genuine in a lot of ways, or at least looking for some kind of authenticity to want to be able to see both sides.
Yeah.
I think we do have a habit, especially in extreme times, to want to focus, close our sights on one thing or another, but
Yeah.
to want to keep that open mind, especially openness to both sides, it can be hard, but to want to do that is really laudable in a lot of ways, I think.
I mean, a lot of the people who are being harmed by this pandemic the most. I mean, so the Union for Gender Empowerment, for anybody who's not aware, we were originally the McGill Women's Union, founded in, I think, 1912.
Wow.
Because originally the SMU was men only. And we evolved over a very long period of time to become inclusive to first transgender women, and then to anybody, regardless of gender. And then we moved on to have a specifically trans positive mandate. We are also, we dedicate ourselves to being anti-racist, anti-colonial, using harm reductive practices, that kind of thing. And we have really evolved over, the 108 years that we've existed. And we've become very focused on advocacy. And in our more recent history, there was this about a year where there was barely anybody who had the capacity to be really involved with the UGE, which is our acronym UGE. And it's only really been since about January or February this year that we've really had more capacity. I was involved back in 2017 and 2018 as a volunteer. Now I'm an employee, but there was this period where I wasn't involved, and that was the time when things were really hard for everybody. And we started to get our capacity again. We had more people involved. We hired more employees, and the pandemic hit. And we made this very frantic transition to offering our services remotely. Our finance and co-op coordinator has done a phenomenal job with making sure that our co-op, which has pay what you can, gender affirming items, disposable and reusable menstrual products, and safer sex supplies, has been available to people not outside of Montreal, but within the greater Montreal area. We have pickup and delivery. It is still pay what you can, although there are delivery fees if you choose that. We have transitioned from having our office, which is a physical, safer space for people to come and chill and relax, to having online office hours with a safer, chiller space. And one of the other things that we really decided was we are going to dedicate ourselves to advocacy this year. We are limited in the services we can provide. We can't open our library to people. We can't do the things that we normally do. There's so much that we're prevented from doing, and it sucks. But we've been connecting a lot with various groups. We were working with the Pan Asian Collective, actually, which Chandni, as she mentioned, is a part of. It's been this opportunity for us to really grow and to not just adhere to our mandate, but to change, as we have changed over the past 108 years. We've had the opportunity to go from a union that was only wealthy white women, all cisgendered, all of a certain social class, to becoming as inclusive as we possibly can. And what we've really dedicated ourselves is to making sure that we are as inclusive as possible and as an active way as possible as we can. So, if there's a barrier that we are facing, what can we do? One of the things we've decided to do was, back in the end of the winter semester, a lot of our funds weren't being used because they'd been planned for events, they'd been planned for in-person activities, they went to our office supplies, that kind of thing. And we reallocated all of those funds to that mutual aid group that was started by a lot of SMU students and employees. And that was, one of the ways that we've been able to do this work. We have, we've really pushed ourselves. And so I think, when we're talking about feeling guilty for relishing in the good things, I have had polar experiences in this pandemic personally. I've faced uncertainty in my housing situation, precarity in my housing. I'm currently on government welfare. All of these things that I didn't experience before in my life, but I've also had such wonderful opportunities. I now live in a home that I'm happy to call home, whereas before I was living in a mess. I am surrounded by people who virtually and physically, in my very small bubble, have dedicated themselves to helping others. And I wouldn't be able to go forward, and neither would any of us at the Huge or many of the people who use our services and belong to our community, without focusing on the good. It's really easy to get overwhelmed by what's bad, but if we focus on what good we have had and what good we've experienced, we can see what's possible for the future. We can see, okay, this sucks, this is the worst, but how can we change this? How can we make this better? What have we learned from the few good experiences that we've had, and how can we build on that? And I think this has been especially true for a lot of marginalized communities. There's been this kind of radical joy that we've had to really experience, and that does include sitting in the sadness and the grief and the fear that we often have, and the precarity, but it also means sitting in the joy that we have experienced, the opportunities that we have had, and it has transformed how we approach our mandates, our goals, our obstacles as well.
For sure, yeah, I think you bring up a really nice point, Mo, which is this idea that the same way that focusing on the bad can let us identify what's going wrong, identifying the good can act as a catalyst for finding ways to make things better. And you talked a lot about adaptation and the way the Huge has adapted over the last 100 years in who they're made up of, but also in the way that they go about supporting their community. This idea that we talked about creating change, it sounds like on an organizational level, it's gone from maybe more of a supportive role. The creating change has turned into an advocacy sort of motion on the part of an organization, as well as that cyber connection that we talked about with Richard has had organizations undergo that same change, the moving on to the cyber platform to be able to continue to do the things that they want to do, but always adapting. So those are really great great parallels, I think, to make between how not just as individuals but as organizations we've been evolving over the last little while. So keeping these thoughts in mind, we're gonna let Stu for a little bit. We're now at our time in our meeting for our 5-minute break. So It is currently 8:05 on my watch. I encourage you guys all to go ahead, turn your cameras off, stand up, stretch, get some water, please. You don't have to stay seated the whole time. And take care of yourselves over the next little bit. Be well, and we'll come and join back in 5 minutes to continue the conversation. And get started. We spent the first half really taking a look at what has changed over the last little while and some of the changes that we've definitely been seeing happening, whether it be on a personal level, on an organizational level, in order to, in some ways, find, but in a lot of ways, create meaning amidst the last little while. One of the things that occurred to me was how we talked about disproportionate ways that uncertainty affects people based off their circumstances. But another thing that occurred to me was the way that uncertainty disproportionately affects the way that we spend our time and energy. And we talked a little bit about how there are some things that are resilient in the face of uncertainty and some things that fall away, those things that were less important in our lives, and I think in some ways external, as they've been described, have been in a lot of ways replaced with internal motivating factors or internal points of orientation for senses of purpose. And that internal focus has actually externalized itself or manifested itself in reaching out to others, bringing action into the world. So it's interesting how that into-out interplay has sort of evolved over the last little while. The second half of the conversation is going to be focused on that external last portion. We talked a lot about how we have become, or a lot of advocates at least, have become more action-oriented and been able to reach out and do things that they hadn't been able to do before. Now comes the next question though, which is when we're doing that reaching out, that starts to change things as well. Reaching out isn't always easy, especially not when we're trying to, as was mentioned in a lot of ways, balance the things that are going on personally in our own lives, but also balance the things that are going on in our audience's lives and in the people that we're trying to help their lives as well. And so the very act of advocacy and the very way that we go about manifesting our internal motivators, I think has also changed over the last little while. And that's going to be the point of focus for the next part of our conversation. So to almost sum it up in like a question to get us started on this idea, how do we balance advocacy with our own well-being as we're trying to be advocates or as we're trying to support one another in the world?
Well, I could speak about my experiences mostly with the Pan Asian Collective. The collective itself is fairly young. It's about 2 or 3 years old only, and I myself joined in February, right before the pandemic. What happened was that in India, there was a huge genocide of Muslims after a completely discriminatory citizenship law was passed in the country. And so we held a vigil for that. And as a South Asian person, there's so little of that I see. Well, these days it's increasing definitely with Black Lives Matter, and so many people are paying much more attention to their actions and how it affects the world around them, the communities around them. Everybody's trying to support Black stores, Black businesses, and it's really amazing to see that outreach. And for me, that started really with that vigil. And I find that in participating with PAC and their initiative, it's been really like heartening. It's advocacy, but it's also finding that community for ourselves and to offer that to others as well. And so PAC is able to do that by, well, at the moment we're trying to encourage people to buy from Chinatown, because Chinatown is struggling a lot with tourism being completely down, with a lot of racism being aimed at Asian people. All of the businesses there are really struggling, and so we're holding a contest to try to support people and encourage people to go down there. And you could check that out at the Pan Asian Collective. It's more active on Facebook and Instagram to get more info about that. But that's it. It's just, you find that, like we said, that sort of internal like rewards from the external actions that we're able to do to kind of bring each other together, to sort of find that interconnectedness, to be able to connect with others and to have that outreach with others, and to like build that community a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a really interesting experience this spring and summer, because for 30 years I've been a basic researcher where I do studies mostly with university students, sometimes with community samples or clinical samples. But I started collaborating with the Black Community Resource Center because I gave a talk about COVID, and there was a former student who heard the talk and said, could you give this talk as a webinar or something? And then I spoke with the people at the Black Community Resource Center, and they were actually interested in doing some research about how the pandemic was affecting the Black community psychologically. And we know that physically, in terms of physical health and mental health, that community's been hit very hard. But something really surprising happened after about 6 weeks of meeting and planning our study. The protests about George Floyd arose, and I was really surprised what happened with those protests and how they spread, and how it seemed to energize so many different people and in so many diverse people. So we actually shifted our research idea from just looking at the negative effects of the pandemic to also looking at the positive effects of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've just finished collecting our first, the results of our first survey. And we are finding what we expected, that it was the Black Lives Matter protest was almost a remedy for all the hopelessness that members of that community were feeling. And what's interesting, though, is we looked at the positive effects of the Black Lives Matters movement and the protests, and we compared the effects on well-being, and there were good positive effects, but the biggest effects were actually social. There was something about participating in the Black Lives Matters protests that re-energized or ignited new friendships, new romantic relationships, and also just gave people something to do with their leisure time. It was almost as if everyone was so cooped up, so alone, so discouraged, and then a positive, well, it wasn't a positive thing, but a movement to become active about a cause really counteracted. And we're going to continue following up people to see how long this counteractive effect lasts. However, I'll tell you the last thing that we just recently found, I'm not sure if it will hold up, but we looked at whether people who were actively involved in the movement benefited more. And we distinguished between people who were actually going physically to the protests versus people who were just posting on social media. And we found that they had opposite effects, that all of the benefits were for the people who were physically active when the protests arose, and that not much was happening. Now, we have to confirm that and everything, but it kind of made sense to me that, in the summer when it was safer to go outside and if we wore a mask, that there was something really special about becoming involved in a very direct, active way in that movement. And so, I found it really interesting to see and very exciting to see. And I am worried again, though, what we'll do over the next 5 months. And it's like I saw a really positive trend, but can we hold on to it now that we are going to be thrown back into the difficult times?
Mm-hmm. It seems like people were at the time looking for an opportunity
Yes.
to be able to get out there and to advocate and to exercise their will to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, just off the top of my head, if the act of going out physically out there for sure has some benefits in that you can meet other people, but it also entails a little bit more risk than it does, let's say if you were to sit and repost. And I'm wondering if taking that risk, making that decision, weighing those options has something to say about how that affects you.
Yeah, I've been earlier this summer. I participated in the Black Lives Matter protests in Montreal, and I think we talk about risk, but as has been confirmed by multiple health organizations, that these protests are not super spreader events in the same ways that other events are. People are safe, people are wearing masks. One of the big things that I think really encourages mask wearing is that people tend to wear masks anyway at these protests. You don't want to be identified. I always, when going to protests in the past, I'm very proud of being Lebanese, and in that I wear my keffiyeh to protest, and I cover my face with it because that's what's safest to do. And in that sense, we have that happening at these protests. But what has actually prevented me from going to a lot of protests more recently was at the last protest I was at. I am not a permanent resident. I am not a citizen. I am here on implied status at the moment. I don't even have an active permit. I'm waiting on a new permit to process. And my friends and I got tailed by the police for about 2 kilometers after the protest. We were leaving and going home, walking the opposite way of the protest. And I had to make the decision. I had to be like, I can't jeopardize my my immigration status. But I think that's really important to consider, is that organizers for these protests are doing such amazing jobs to make sure that these events are safe. I was participating with friends as part of street medical aid, and providing cleaning solutions for people who are getting hit with tear gas, helping people who were hurt. There was at one protest, there was this one girl who completely jacked up her ankle, getting tripping over a tear gas canister, and it was brutal. But organizers are doing their best to make sure that people are respecting physical distancing, that people are wearing masks, that there's first aid being provided. People are providing food and water at these protests. And what is causing the real danger is the structural inequalities that we are facing. When I'm a permanent resident, I'm going to happily, gladly go to these protests again. And it's not being immunocompromised that's preventing me from going to these protests. And then I think the other thing to consider about the Black Lives Matter movement is, so I've recently graduated back in the winter 2020 semester. And I wrote my thesis in my final year on the development, tactics, and legacies of various social movements and in global context, and comparing them globally. And one of the social movements I analyzed was Black Lives Matter. And I remember in my introduction, I said, I'm framing this as a Black Lives Matter movement in 2014 to 2017, this movement hasn't ended. This movement is still ongoing. We're analyzing it in this specific framework. And then lo and behold, a few months later, here it is again. And so I think there is this, it's really important to remember that, you know, even before 2014, it wasn't like there weren't civil rights advocates. There wasn't like there wasn't a Black Power movement. It wasn't like there weren't Black radicals and revolutionaries doing amazing work. It's not like there hasn't been this kind of sense of allyship. Where are we going to go from here? What is going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years where we look back on this and we say, where were the organizations that I was part of? What were we doing? Where were we as a society at? And how have we continued from this? You know, I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is I want to make sure that I'm doing things that in 10, 15 years, I am proud to say I participated in that. You know, I am proud to say I made sure that I contributed to the communities that have given so much to me, and that I am able to give back to them. And so that's been really important. And I guess sort of additionally, Richard, you spoke about the benefits that we've seen, the social benefits of these amazing, powerful, and important social movements. But there's also been times when, you know, the participation in the social movements themselves, this extends beyond the pandemic, but has been so real within the pandemic, is the kind of burnout that organizers and advocates and activists face. You go really hard for a few weeks working on a campaign, organizing certain protests, getting people to show up to something. You know, in my work in labor organizing that I've done with SMU, I have had, you know, a month and a half, 2 months where I've gone absolutely hams and staying up until like 3 a.m. working on important things for the labor union. And then after that's over, I just need a break. I need a month off of doing absolutely nothing. And so, you know, sort of understanding that now we are constantly advocating. We are constantly being faced with all of these things that, you know, you have to deal with the pandemic, you have to deal with people having precarity in housing, economic precarity, in addition to all the normal shit that we deal with in our day-to-day lives, especially for marginalized people. When does that break come? And so a lot of it has really been in the circles that I've been in, passing off to other people who have the capacity, taking turns, making sure we're checking in with each other and saying, are you good? Do you need me to take this on right now? Having by-elections to change, you know, who the executive positions are, because there's so much going on that, you know, we thought we would be able to do this back in January, February, and now it's just, you know, we're facing these impossible circumstances. And so we're really starting to like rely on each other in ways that we have before, but in new forms, to make sure that we can keep going and sustain this energy, because we aren't having any breaks. There isn't a time when we can just take a deep breath and relax. We have to keep going, and we have to make sure that we can rely on each other so that we as individuals can take breaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you point out something really to the heart of it, Mo, which is this idea that advocacy work, especially now, in a time of uncertainty, can be unrelenting. It can be nonstop. And I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit towards that idea, you know, the idea that there is a genuine risk when it comes to being an advocate. In your case, it was a citizenship risk on a certain level, but there's also, like, you know, the personal risk of investing that kind of energy into it. And I'm wondering, how can we continue to, well, if this is the way that we're creating purpose in our lives, how can we keep that up, especially when, you know, there's so much that's going on?
The word that keeps coming in my head is boundaries, right? Because, you know, that quote, and I can't remember who said it, you know, we rise by lifting others. I had that up in my old office for years. And now, not only is it not up in my office, but I think it's totally untrue. I don't think we rise by helping others. I think that it can be certainly renewing and energizing and invigorating and give us a sense of purpose. But for us to have the sustainability, right, Mo, that you were pointing to, we have to fill our own cup first. And it's hard. I think it's harder than ever because we're so pulled to have meaning, to feel good, that, you know, taking the time when, you know, like you said, delegating or leaning on each other, trying to work out a system where you're not constantly engaged. I don't think I've ever worked harder in my career, ever. I've never put in this many hours. I've never been so invested. And I think that's shared by students, staff, faculty, people across the university. And partially because we all feel this fire to engage, to help, to find a solution. But at the same time, so many students and staff and faculty saying that they feel burnt out, right? They feel so stretched. We're stretched too thin. So, you know, I think I just want to throw in there that we have to be careful not to, you know, fill ourselves up too heavily on the advocacy side if we're not balancing it with that other part of like, I'm going to stop, I'm going to close myself off for a little bit, I'm going to do what I have to do to renew. And it sounds like you all do that, right? But I think it's been a bigger challenge than ever to do that. And yeah, I just feel like that's something that it's right now, there's a tension between those two things. There's a tension between wanting to help and engage, because when we feel hopeless, engagement helps soothe that, right?
Yeah.
So I want to caution that. And this is advice I give myself on a daily, right? Is like, okay, Shannon, are you watching your boundaries? Because if you really want to continue to help at the level you've been helping, you can't be on the floor pushing people up. You have to be like steady, right? So, yeah.
I think the concern about boundaries is very real. I have meetings in the evening. I do research meetings on weekends, and I never used to do that. So I can't even, you know, if you ask me what day it is of the week, I couldn't tell you. I have no idea. I can't even differentiate weekends from weekdays anymore. And the other point I'd like to, you know, I hope it's not taking us, but besides the people who are out there advocating in a visible way, I actually think there's a lot of people who've stepped up in organizations who are just keeping things going and who take a lot on themselves. So I'm in an academic department with 42 professors. There's probably 100 graduates, there's 10 other kind of staff. And there's many things that have to be done for the common good. And I would say there's about 5 people who do 95% of all of that. And there's more to do for the common good during a pandemic. There's more checking in, there's more rearranging of classes. And I was really surprised. One of my best friends, he's thinking of taking a leave of absence because he's just exhausted. He can't go on anymore. And this is, you know, he's one of these guys, he's the responsible guy who's always taking on more responsibilities and looking out for others. And I think that's happening, that even just maintaining an okay level of functioning in the department has been really hard for the people, for the 5 or 6 people who are doing all of that work. So I do think there's a danger of burnout and fatigue. I'm not so worried about Zoom fatigue, which everyone's talking about. I'm more worried about responsibility fatigue. And then there's also advocacy fatigue. And I did want to say, too, that before I gave my first talk, I used a McGill lecture that David St. Jacques, the astronaut, gave about surviving on the space shuttle or the space station for 210 days. And he recommended you have hinted at this too, we do have to take care of ourselves. But he said what we need is a routine. We do need boundaries. We have to wake up at the same time. We have to make sure we get our breakfast, our lunch. He builds in a routine where he does crossword puzzles or he reads something. So he does something. Some of us feel bad ever taking time for ourselves because there's so many people who need us. He makes sure he takes time to do that for himself. And the routines are really helpful. One thing that I've done is I try to do some things that help me get through time. I think part of our challenge is that this is a weird place we're in, and we're all wondering when will it get when will we be back to our normal lives? And some of us wonder, when will we be back to our normal selves? So I think if you have any kind of routine that helps you feel like you're getting through time okay and keeping your boundaries. So that the example I'll give, I'm ashamed to say I watch TV shows, and I like to watch, like I'm watching Schitt's Creek right now, and there's 6 seasons, and I watch one episode every couple days. And I never watch more than one episode because I want this to take me 3 months. I want this to get me 1/3 of the way through the pandemic. And it turned out I picked a beautiful show because it's these very wealthy, jet-setting people who lose everything, and they're reduced to living in a motel room. And we've all been reduced to living in a motel room and not flying anywhere and eating at restaurants. But the show is lovely because they do gain more depth and they understand each other better and they figure out the intrinsic rewards. Uh, but so any trick I can come up with that helps me get through time. So yes, I want to be doing good things. I want to find meaning, but I also just want to get through and for us right now, I think we just need to get through 5 more months. And we want to help others and everything, but to some extent, it's just how do we survive mentally and physically for the next 4 or 5 months?
Sure, those routines and setting in those breaks into those routines, I think is going to be certainly invaluable to moving forward. Chandani, I saw that you had unmuted a few times. I imagine that
Sorry.
you had something that you wanted to add there, so I'm going to invite you to do so right before we go into our Q&A session. So Chandani, you had the last word over there. But as we move forward in this conversation, I invite anybody who wants to ask questions to the panelists in general or to any individual panelists. I think we've been privileged to get to know some of you and the stuff that you do, a little more of your backgrounds. Please do forward that question over to Anna. Anna's my content co-director, and she's going to be the one filtering through the questions as we do in the last part. Hello, Anna. So yeah, if you guys have any questions that you want to go ahead and ask the panelists, individual or as a group, please go ahead and send them over to Anna as we move forward. Now, Chandni, you want to make a comment on those ways to be able to keep it up?
Well, I wanted to say a couple of things that like, I hope my thought is going to be cohesive because a lot of people said a lot of things that resonated with me in different ways. So one of the first things was kind of going out to protest versus staying online and protesting on your phone. And so when you go out to these protests, I've been to quite a few, and honestly, there's just some of the like most amazing events ever. It's some of the most safest spaces that I've ever been to. The community that you feel and the togetherness in those moments are so strong. It's so moving to see all these people show up for whatever you're protesting, whether that was the pipeline that was being built, whether that was Black Lives Matter or people moving into Indigenous territories. Yeah, and so these events, these protests, it's like Mo had said, some people think that they're going to be really unsafe, but it's amazing how safe they are. They've even like the Black Lives Matter one of the earliest ones, there was like a huge turnout and pretty much shut down downtown for like a day. And even amongst all that, people took up space. There was so much room around me to breathe, and everybody was wearing a mask. Like, I don't think I saw anybody without a mask. And so like these people that do show up to these things, they're really showing up for the cause. They're showing up for the people. They're showing up to really show up. There's hand sanitizer being passed around. There's snacks being passed around. You'll meet so many people that are just there to like take care of each other and take care of you and take care of themselves in showing up. And so there's that side of going out and being there for the cause versus online, which is a lot of it is very performative. There's lots of people that will post a black square but never actually do anything about it, right? There's well, what happened recently that came to mind is when Kamala Harris was elected, a lot of these allies, they were hating on her. So I saw so much of like, how can you support Kamala Harris and be ACAB? How can you support her and be for BLM? And it was so traumatizing and so painful, and it felt like such a betrayal from these people, all of these like white people that call themselves allies and that put up the performance of activism and then turn around and do that. Meanwhile, all people of color were the ones that were celebrating her. And the reason for that is that, like, yes, I acknowledge that she is problematic and she has done her fair share of awful things and incarcerated a lot of people that definitely shouldn't have been. But just to have a half Indian, half Black woman as VP was so incredibly strong to so many people, including myself, including Indian people, including Black people, women identifying people, and to have people like turn around and kind of like shut that down completely and like shame us for celebrating that representation was just like the biggest betrayal of all. So when you're making that distinction between like online activism and showing up in person, you're also kind of making that distinction between like whose voices are you allowing to be heard. If you're going up there and you're saying like, and you're going against all these people that are celebrating this success and you're shutting them all completely down, like how is your activism actually working? Are you being harmful, or are you like just shutting more people down? Who are you standing for? The people of color, or more yourself and your own thoughts? And that kind of also made me think of a lot of people were talking about resting when you're an activist. Resting is almost a privilege to a lot of people. Resting or self-care, sometimes that could be a privilege for a lot of people. When you're a marginalized person, you don't really have the time to rest because you're faced with it every day. You're faced with the racism, you're faced with the discrimination. How many like times in the past couple of months that I like open up social media or the news to see another trans person was murdered? How many times did I like hear that like the numbers in India are going like increasingly higher and higher and spreading to all of the lowercase people? And how worried have I been for my family that's in like this tiny little town that like has no access to anything? And like, it's not everybody that could rest. It's so many times like you're not allowed to take breaks because you see it so constantly and it's so blatantly. And so that's it. Rest is so important for sure, to turn everything off and to take times for yourself. But it's also important to know that like it's not the case for everybody that's allowed to do that. And so what you could do is kind of like allow marginalized people to be able to have their voices heard, and so they don't have to fight so hard to be heard, and they don't have to like be screaming at the top of their lungs for this entire time. Like Indigenous people have been like screaming about climate change for so long and no one has listened to them up until now, and then all of a sudden Greta Thunberg shows up and there's millions of people showing up to the climate march. Like, you know, like
it's frustrating. It really is.
Yeah.
When the question that I'm hearing underlying, it's almost like where's that break supposed to come from, in a way, especially when you look at those marginalized communities who don't get a break. They don't have that same opportunity for rest. Like, I almost get that the sentence that comes to mind in a lot of ways is evil never sleeps. And that balance, that idea of where's that break going to come from? Is it going to come from us who are already exhausted, or is that break supposed to, be realized by somebody else's actions? That's also something that's, I think, worth reflecting on as a group, as a society. Thank you guys so much for those really interesting different angles, comments, and perspectives. I think it's so valuable to be able to hear each other's and our different and the different voices. And I'm really grateful, I'm going to be honest, on a personal note, that we were able to have like a very simple, like one at a time conversation on Zoom where we could hear each other all the way out. I know that not all virtual conferences do allow for people to hear each other all the way out. So that's been really great to be able to see. Thank you guys for, giving so much of yourselves tonight in order to be able to have these conversations in the first place. I'm going to go turn it over to Anna, who I think will have a thing or two to ask, and we're gonna basically take that as our slow wrap up before we get to our 9 p.m. mark. But Anna, I bring it over to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It was really great hearing everyone's perspective. I definitely think it was a very productive panel. So thank you again for all of the insight. So the first question that I have here is for Shannon. And it says, since you work directly with students, how do you think this isolation will change or impact the kinds of problems students will come to you with post-COVID-19?
Great question. So how will it impact after we're out of this phase? I don't know. I mean, isolation was already one of the top 2-3 things that were leading to, high levels of anxiety and depression amongst not only our university, but universities like ours across the nation. I think obviously because we've all been isolated, right? And, you pointed to before, like some people to levels that, really completely alone, not even speaking to another person or having any interaction with someone else. I think that, and maybe this is more of a hope than a think, I hope that when we have more freedom, that those that struggled with isolation pre-pandemic and had it even more so during these last 7-8 months, that they will feel some relief and in a way, an appreciation of connection that they didn't get to benefit from before. But that's a hope, okay? I think that, it's going to really depend on what happens in this next 5 or 6 months. People are really struggling, and I've never ever seen or felt that anguish like I felt it. So I hope that when things open up again, isolation will, diminish and people will feel more connected. But it really depends on, how are those people coping and are they able to get through this next stretch? Because the reality is, for many, it's been a struggle that has been insurmountable. So, yeah.
Thank you for your response. So the next question I have here is for Richard. So you had mentioned briefly that social media has been an integral part of your mother's wellness kit. What other aspects do you think are important for individuals to have in their wellness kit?
Yeah, that's great. I'll tell you the other thing my mother does is she's 87, and about 3 years ago she got a new doctor, and he was a young guy, and he was an MD, PhD, and she freaked out because he told her that she eats too much, she has to change her diet, she has to get more exercise, and that she's not really as fit as she thinks. And he told her that she should start using hiking poles when she walks. There's something about circulation as you get older where the hiking poles works very well. And at first she objected to this recommendation. Then she found a park across this, a couple blocks from her, and she started hiking with the hiking poles, and she couldn't believe how good it made her feel. So her routine now, part of what she uses the iPad for is to track the radar for the weather. And so even on a rainy day, she will find a 40-minute period where she could sneak out with her hiking poles and do her 2 mile walk or something. And I have a similar routine. So many of you probably lost some places that you usually go to. There's this concept of all of us need a third place. We have our family, we have our work, but we need a third place where we could get away from our family and work, and which feels like a nice, safe place where people like you. And for me, it was the YMCA. And there's some people I know there. I watch the TV, I do a workout, but that's closed down. And so that means, I'm a 60-year-old guy. I'm not getting exercise. So for the first time in my life, I started running. I live next to the bicycle path on de Maisonneuve, and I started running there. And I don't like running necessarily, but I would listen to a book on tape. I listened to fantasy, what do they call it? Epic fantasy stories. And if I could find a trilogy, that takes me through time too. So I think having a routine where you wake up, you go for a run, you're listening to a story, it just gets your day off to a good start. Actually, in the last month, I've abandoned that routine. I'm so busy, and I always think, well, I'm going to go jogging at 12. No, I'm going to go jogging at 3. And I've gone 5 days without jogging because I don't have that structure and that plan and that routine. So I think I've lost something by not maintaining something good that was working for me. So besides the iPad and the social communication, I do think it's good to be outside and to be getting exercise and to be out in nature. It's very reaffirming and re-energizing. So if you could do that with hiking poles, if you could do that with roller skates, if you could do that with a skateboard, however you can do it, I think that's something to consider. And myself and a lot of other people, we find that the physical activity helps us manage our emotions, especially anxiety. So that's really helpful to me.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Might have to invest in some hiking poles now.
Oh, it's a really surprising thing, and it's good for your knees too to use hiking poles.
Really, I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is for just anyone who would like to answer. So it's what lessons, or maybe even more technical things like telemedicine, do you believe we'll carry with us after the pandemic?
Can I answer? I would love to just speak on behalf of the hub. All of the things that we're doing, we had wanted to do, right? We've been talking about them for years and years and years. We wanted a hybrid model. We wanted to offer online. And then, of course, the pandemic happens, and within days, we're seeing students online. We've set ourselves up. And I mean, I know, because we keep asking, we keep saying, we want to be assured that there is going to be that option moving forward, because I think a lot of students have really appreciated the flexibility. And I'm just going to say, as a Mac person, man, has it been nice to connect with the Mac students and connect those students with downtown students in a much easier way. Whereas before, they couldn't attend therapy groups because they happen during the day and they have to shuttle and they have classes, on the West Island. I think there's barriers that have been broken between the two campuses. So my answer is absolutely those things are going to continue. Support groups, workshops, one-on-ones. The way that I'm hoping it will go is a student will present at the hub and they'll be asked, do you want in person or online? And be given the choice, because we have to have as many ways for people to be helped as possible. So sorry, I don't know if you were going to say that too, Richard. I know you were also unmuting yourself, but I get very excited about what advances have happened and will continue that would have taken years to mobilize. So yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, oh, sorry, Richard, do you want to go? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I was going to say similar things. I've actually been talking about this recently, and actually my work as mental health advocacy coordinator, we currently have 2 surveys out right now. One on your experience with the Wellness Hub since the pandemic, and one on your experiences with remote learning. And obviously there's a lot of difficulties going on. You know, people are pointing out to things that they've had issues with. Obviously the hardest part about the hub being online is that, you know, legally doctors can't serve people who are not in Quebec. And so, you know, people have faced barriers like that. But we've also seen a lot of people say, like, things are easier now. You know, I remember I'm immunocompromised because I'm chronically ill. I have endometriosis, and it is not always a disability for me, but there are times when it's really disabling. And the times when it's disabling, the times that I need to access healthcare, I couldn't walk up the hill to the hub at 7 a.m. to get an appointment. That was impossible for me. And, you know, I had to figure out other ways to manage my health. And now I'm seeing how the hub has adapted, and I'm thinking, wow, like, you know, in the next few years and hopefully into the future, you know, students who have, you know, issues both with like chronic health and also just having a cold, and you shouldn't have to, or having the flu or bronchitis, or whatever, you shouldn't have to get out of bed and go to a building full of other sick people at a ridiculous hour in the morning. And so, you know, that kind of change. And I'm also thinking about how in the beginning of the semester, in my last semester, I was taking this class, and, you know, I'm hard of hearing, and I prefer to have lecture recordings. And so I went to a professor and I said, hey, could you provide lecture recordings? You know, explaining why, how, you know, it's easier for me to refer back to. He turns around, shows me his hearing aid, and says no. And it was just shocking. But then, you know, a month and a half, 2 months later, I'm live and everything's recorded. And it became a moot point. And so I'm really hoping that, you know, one of the reasons he said, you know, I'm not going to offer things online, which I think is not a good reason. He was saying, well, I can't engage, like if I can't get students to come to class, then I can't engage them. And I don't think you should be holding your students hostage for them to engage with you. And there's certainly ways that you can engage online and with lecture recording. But, you know, all of these professors, you know, my dad's an adjunct back in New York, and we've talked about the ways that he's had to adapt with all these, you know, you're giving a lecture and there's all these black screens with, you know, little names, and everybody's on mute, nobody has their video on. But, you know, we're learning, we're seeing how to make sure that students stay engaged, how students learn. And as a result, a lot of things that people with disabilities, both mental and physical, have been asking for a very long time, we're finally getting them. And it's really satisfying, but also kind of hurts, because you're like, damn, my issues weren't enough for you. But hopefully we won't have those issues going forward. Arundhati Roy says the pandemic is a portal. And I think that's a really beautiful way of looking at it, that, you know, we're not going to go back to normal, we're going to go to better.
I think that's a beautiful note to close this conference on. The pandemic is a portal. Is that, yeah, that's it. And, you know, the things that we're seeing now are lived in real time. I wonder what it's going to be like when we look back on this. But for now, what I can say is thank you guys so much for joining. I'm going to invite the staff to please turn on their cameras, just as a little show of thank you for all of our panelists and everybody coming out today to be able to talk and to be able to share with us your perspectives. We really appreciate it. Thank you all so much. Just a little bit of a recap as we close our panel for tonight. You guys are going to all receive a little email from us with a link to the recording. If you guys do want to rewatch, if you guys do want to re-listen, we're going to make that accessible for you guys, as well as some links to our social media sites to be able to continue the conversation. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. We're doing other events and workshops. And if you have any questions whatsoever, you can always email us at studentsinmind.internal@gmail.com or studentsinmind@gmail.com if you want to get in touch with us all directly. Once more, on behalf of the whole Students in Mind staff, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Thank you all so much for listening. If you're listening to a recording somewhere else, we hope that this has benefited you in some way or another, whenever you may be. So with all this uncertainty and looking for purpose and in these troubled times, I just want to wish you all wholeheartedly and genuinely be well, everybody. Take care.